With it being Kinnikuman Day, and that I like to do comparison videos, I'll fulfill this request from Mecha Missionary of comparing Kinnikuman's revival run to Kinnikuman Nisei on shared and continued ideas or broader topics, as there's clearer comparisons if going beyond the perfect origin arc, but English translations still being limited. This will only cover up to chapter 872. To go over the broader parts first, it's worth comparing how they handle one of the selling points of Kinnikuman, being the attention divided between its cast. This is something the revival run excels at, with it allowing even fairly minor characters from the original to have their moments and know when or when not to focus on Kinnikuman, such as the Six Spears arc being more focused on the five fated princes, and this is unfortunately something Nisei didn't come close to matching the original or revival on, as even though it allowed for many of the redeemed Chojin to have their moments in the Demon Seed or the Tag arc, having great character growth in how the next generation interacted with the legends. The early events being very Mantaro-centric at the expense of his peers definitely held it back there. A clear example of how both sequels handle this would be in their jobber characters, with Canadian Man in the Six Spears arc being very aware of how he's perceived, but having the pride to carry on, and rarely making the audience want him to have an earned victory, despite how inevitable the contrary was, whereas Gazelle Man is treated so pathetically that his introduction has him get a lot of hype, only to be jumped and eventually devolving to the point his elimination in the Chojin Olympics preliminaries is glossed over, and he doesn't even bother coming along for the time travel mission. The next thing both these sequels do is expand on the world of the original, but both do so in different areas. Nisei homes in on expanding social aspects of the Chojin world, such as the issues they have integrated into human society, whereas the revival expands on elements of the wider setting mechanics that weren't explored deeply in the original, or fills in some loose threads towards its world, such as the identity of justice. The details on how the burning inner strength and friendship power really work, or Chojin Enma. Overall, the expansions from the Perfect Origin arc and onwards was more essential than what Nisei did for its setting, to make it far more coherent, even if both did very well in their own way. Another element of world building both sequels share is the idea of the Time Chojin, though I'm hesitant to compare both when things like Chaos's Return, or a version of Nisei still being part of the revival continuity, make what's been done now a continuation of the ideas from the Nisei Tag arc. But to go over the difference, the Time Chojin in Nisei are treated as an evolution of the Zangaku Chojin, whereas those in the current manga are created by the God of Time, though this new edition does add a lot more to them. This is something I'd say Nisei did better, at least thus far, as Thunder and Lightning's Chojin Gyodor was at a fine level both for the opponents they faced, and proved dangerous enough with their time manipulation that reaching the power of top tiers wasn't necessary to be overwhelming threats, whereas the Five Great Times all being as strong as the gods on paper seems a bit much. That said, another thing to compare with both series is the escalation of threats. This is something Nisei had a far smoother time with, through its next generation status and new moves to counter their predecessors made surpassing the previous top tiers unnecessary, with the Suguru that Mantaro defeats even in the Tag arc still not being at his peak, and what could be classed as a lower top tier fighter of the original run in Mammoth Man doesn't lose a fair fight, while a major increase in scale through the return of Ashura Man or Neptune Man as enemies comes through their far greater experience. Meanwhile, the level Kinnikuman reached at the end of the original run in the characters he could defeat and unparalleled techniques he'd acquired, as the revival run have to tread carefully. Perfect Origin accomplished this well, perfect, with the kind of opponents he faced, as well as the caliber of incredibly experienced Perfect Chojin being a fair step up for most of the Seigi and Akuma Chojin without going overboard. And the Six Spears prove a good threat both through the limitations on who can fight them, and the Five Fated Princes not having access to their god power, aside from Super Phoenix at the tail end of his fight with Aristera. It's with the Choshin that things start to push the limit there, with them having only slightly slightly less power than a peak Super Phoenix, and now the 5 great times having strength equal to the gods. Though the revival has handled this escalation well, it is far more of a narrow tightrope when it comes to delving into power creep, especially with what's now happened to someone as impressive as Nemesis. With those broader aspects covered, there's direct comparisons to be found in certain major characters that I'll go over now. The first is obviously Kinnikuman, where the treatment of him after the peak he'd reached is far different in both. Though the revival's version of giving him incredible opponents like Nemesis or Magnificent adds to his sense of identity and upholding of his predecessor's will, the limitations of where his character can go holds less of an impact than what Nisei did to him in a forced retirement from injuries, bolstered by not having access to the burning inner strength against Super Phoenix, with this deterioration being one of the best things about Nisei in showcasing the truths of wrestling and sports in general, with what is the closest the series will likely come to exploring the same themes as a masterpiece like Ashita no Joe. For similar reasons, I'd say the Nisei version of Sunshine is the best iteration of the character, with how far he's fallen, along with his depressive attempt to relive his glory days as an Akuma Chojin when not cut out for leaving that life behind. Whereas Sunshine's main additions in the revival are a good win and an emotional send-off, that's not to say it's without merit, as it's quite nice how his role both shows his way of taking on the ideals of friendship he'd acknowledged, and is almost a path his Nisei self would wish for, but the sadder state of him as a bitter mentor is a lot more striking. To bring up another bitter mentor in Nisei, his version of Brocken Jr. may be the best incarnation of the character, as someone always treated as a step below most of the other idol Chojin, being given a realistic aftermath in his lack of purpose until finding a successor. Though the version of him in the Perfect Origin and Six Spears arc does a great job making up for this, with some impressive fights, including being able to fight alongside the soldier he idolizes, his mentor role in how Jade showcases the lessons he gave him, that include what may be the most iconic quote of the tag arc. Give the older version of him a lot more depth, though I will say the altered version of him in the Nisei tag arc wasn't used as well as he is currently, when being forced into jobber status yet again. Perhaps the returning character most difficult to judge in which version is better is Warsman, as both sequels do a lot to improve his character. The version of him Nisei not only shows the cycle of mentorship well by teaching his mentor's son, but him being far more willing to use his brutal techniques but not lose himself to them, showcases his natural peak in balancing his deadly attributes with the experienced, mature mind he's gained. His revival run has a similar arc of having him address his robot and Chojin attributes through the opponents he fights, as well as upholding Robin Mask's legacy as the new Seigi Chojin leader. If I had to make a choice, I'd go with Revival Warsman, due to the additional aspect of delving more into his past, and how that plays into the emotional aspect of his fights. There's then 2 other experienced returning characters, having much added to them, and in both cases, the Nisei version is far better. Reborn Ashura Man explores some difficult themes in terms of an Akuma Chojin's nature, and whether or not they can truly move beyond it, while Neptune Man shows someone craving their glory days, before developing a surprising father-son bond with Mammoth Man. By comparison, their revival selves have yet to do any major growth, beyond a few wins and being set up as key figures for the future of their respective factions. As for another character that returned to their roots, the revival version of Buffalo Man is far better than his Nisei self, and even his original manga self, as he's given a very dynamic character arc in returning to the Akuma Chojin in order to shoulder the burdens the other idol Chojin can't, before seeking out strength to uphold his pride as the last of the Buffalo clan, being an excellent dynamic arc. Whereas his older Nisei self doesn't really add much to his character, nor does the past version of him in the tag arc. The final returning idol Chojin worth mentioning would be Robin Mask, as both have drastically different additions to his arc. His Nisei self in both past and future have his role as a father play a heavy part in his character. Still, I'd say his revival self is better, as along with fleshing out his previous dynamic changes far better, the definition of his rivalry with Kinnikuman is a very necessary dynamic that also creates some parallels to their sons. Away from an idol Chojin, there's an Akuma Shogun, where both versions are far different, and the perfect origin arc version is inarguably the infinitely superior version, with it going in depth on his philosophy behind the Akuma Chojin, along with a sense of duty to stop the man who's become corrupted over time that crafts one of the most morally complex and nuanced characters in the franchise. Meanwhile, the version of Akuma Shogun in the Demon Seed arc is one of the worst parts of Nisei, as there's no explanation as to why he went back to the Akuma Chojin, or him being conflated with Satan. The final broad point to cover would be a major drawn point of the franchise, in new wrestling techniques, something that was always a difficult thing to shine with how perfect some from the original were, but both managed to create moves just as iconic or masterful as the top tier techniques in the original manga. Muscle Millennium is a great finishing move, Muscle Gravity is both very intense and a near perfect lock, as is the Olap. The Revival era has the same, with even moves that are evolutions of previous techniques, such as Halo Special, The End, Naked Tower Bridge, or God's Guillotine, all having enough additions to be perfect examples of improving the fundamentals. Honestly, both are equally great in this area, but even though aesthetically I prefer Nisei's, I'd offer the win for the Revival, with it staying more consistent to the logic behind certain techniques, such as Warsman's use of kinetic energy to boost his Chojin Kyodo. With all that said, despite Nisei handling some characters better, and the next generation aspect allowing for things like threat escalation to not reach absurd degrees, I would say the Revival era of the manga is the better sequel, with the expansions and coherency it brings to the setting, how cathartic many of the character moments are, and greater division of time between major and minor characters. However, both are excellent sequels to Kinnikuman that serve as examples of how a continuation of a beloved series should be. Or in short, this panel here sums up everything. Thank you for watching, like and subscribe, check out my previous Kinnikuman videos, and see another next Kinnikuman day, if not sooner.